Welcome to another episode of Silver Lining for Learning. And this is a very tough time in the US today. If you look at not only we have the pandemic, we have the protest, we have the death of George Floyd, we have all these big changes. It's a challenging day for us to have another episode of this, honestly. But we think this is important. We need to go on. So I want to thank our two guests today. It's Cecilia Aragon and Katie Davis, authors of Writers in the Sacred Garden, to this show. And we invited them primarily because we're interested in massive mentorship. I particularly myself really try to think about how do we run education without necessarily having the traditional school. Can learning happen in other places, in other ways? And I'm so happy we have today Katie and Cecilia. What I would like to do is to invite each of you to do a brief introduction about yourself, and then we're going to start the conversation about your book, what you discovered, and what continued research has done, and what your thoughts about this kind of massive environments, what's the implications for education. Cecilia, why don't we start with you?
All right, well, thank you very much, Yang, and I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. Yeah, so Katie and I have been working together since 2013 when we first met at the University of Washington. I'll start with an introduction of just myself and let Katie talk about herself, but this book certainly wouldn't have happened without us being able to work together. So I am a professor at UW and the director of the Human-Centered Data Science Lab. My background is in computer science and collaborative online work. And I have a long list of affiliations. I don't know how interesting those all are, but my primary affiliation is in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. I've been working in human-centered data science, human-computer interaction, and data science for many years. First, I worked in industry as a data scientist and software developer. I did that for about 15 years. And then I moved into academia, and I've been here for about 10 years. So I guess that's probably enough. I assume you'll ask us more specific questions about our research later.
Will do. Katie? Thank you, Cecilia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting. So my name is Katie Davis. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington. My primary affiliation there is the Information School. My background is in education, and in fact, I've known Chris for quite a while because I got my doctorate, actually 2 masters and a doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I studied human development and education. I am the co-founder and co-director of the Digital Youth Lab at the Information School at UW. And my research focuses on the conditions under which interactive technology use either supports or undermines the agency and well-being of adolescents and emerging adults. And I look at different areas of their lives, such as identity development, social and relationships, and learning. And then at the Information School, a lot of the work that we do focuses on taking empirical work and translating that into some sort of intervention, and often something that is inspired by design. And so I try and use my work to design interactive technology experiences that are personally engaging for young people and support their positive youth development.
Great, thank you both. So let's get started with the book or any other information you want to bring in. Just can you tell us, most of us may not even be aware of this massive learning systems, like fan fiction writing clubs, and there's Scratch, there's other Minecraft. People do teach and learn in different ways. But in schools, we're in education, we only talk about school curriculum, how school manage them. Just tell us about your discoveries. And I've read parts of your writing. You were talking about you yourself. How do you get involved in this? Just any one of you, please.
Do you want to
Cecilia,
start?
do you want to? Well, yeah, sure. I'll start by really, it all started with Cecilia and I having a conversation. I think we sat beside each other at a gathering at UW for researchers who do some form of human-computer interaction research. And we started talking about our research and our interest in youth and technology. And we found that we had a lot of common interests. And I think that we decided to extend the conversation over lunch. And, one thing that we were talking about a lot is, this was, I think, in 2013, this common perception that there's a lot of fear and negative perceptions associated with what young people are doing online. And it doesn't really align so much with what we are seeing in our research, all of the really great things, both in our research and also in our personal lives with the people in our families and extended communities. So we wanted to study and see what are the positive things that young people are doing online. And we both had interest in fan fiction for slightly different reasons. And I'll let Cecilia talk about her particular interest in fan fiction. For me, I come to the topic, I think, mostly as an outsider. I've never written fan fiction myself, but when I was at Harvard, my first research project, my first solo research project, was studying young people's community around fandom in LiveJournal, which has transformed quite a bit over the years. But back then, this was in 2007, 2008, a lot of young people would come to LiveJournal, actually people of all ages, not just to write their online journal, but also to share their love for fandom, different fan cultures. And so that's when I became interested in this phenomenon of just the incredible passion and dedication that young people bring, and they will just pour hours and hours into writing about the different fandoms they love, whether it's Harry Potter or Twilight, and read other people's writing, talk about their writing, talk about their art. And it's really quite inspiring. It can be very different from what you see in the classroom environment. So I'll stop talking and I'll let Cecilia talk about her particular interest, because Cecilia comes at it from a more insider perspective.
All right, go ahead,
Yeah.
Cecilia.
So yeah, thanks, Katie. Okay, so I'm going to give a little personal story. So I grew up in Indiana. I was the daughter of immigrants. I'm Latina, and everybody in my small town community was pretty much white. And I felt very much like an outsider. And what I started doing was turning to fantasy and science fiction. So I read The Lord of the Rings when I was 10 years old, and I just fell in love with it. And I escaped into this world. And but then I said, oh, but there's some problems with this book. There aren't enough female characters, for example. And so I said, oh, I can fix that. And so I rewrote The Lord of the Rings and added in all these female characters, and I regendered some of the main characters, and I put in a scene about a female hobbit solving the problem where where Gandalf fights the Balrog, but she came up with this clever ploy to do this. And I had no clue that what I was doing was writing fan fiction, because in those years, it turned out there were people exchanging fan fiction, but it wasn't online, and I wasn't really aware of it. I didn't go to conventions. I was very shy. My parents, you know, as immigrants, really weren't plugged into American society that well. You know, fast forward many years later, and I had 2 kids of my own, and I started getting worried because they were online a lot. And I thought, oh, they don't read. Maybe they're not going to write. Maybe they're not going to learn how to write. And this is something that Katie mentioned too, is that there's this conventional wisdom. Young people today don't know how to write long form. And so I noticed though that, so my son he was like in 3rd grade, and he was asked to write a 10-page essay, and he just sat down and wrote it, and he used a significant vocabulary. I thought, where did you learn all this? Because you're not reading any books. And he said, oh, well, I participate in these online role-playing games, and so I read and I write stories. And my daughter said, yeah, and I read and write fan fiction. And that's teaching me how to write as well. And I've learned how to, they both learned how to type. All these things that I thought required formal learning, they were teaching it to themselves, and their peers were teaching them. So when I met Katie at this lunch, we were both kind of sharing similar experiences. And we said, well, you know, if the conventional wisdom is that young people these days don't know how to write, and both of us disagree with this, aha, there must be a research topic in this. And so we just jumped into it, and we started a research group, and we advertised it to the University of Washington, and we got more applications than I've ever received in a research group before. And so we picked some of the most enthusiastic and best students, and we started a long-term research project with all of them.
So let me ask the question to start with, and to both of you, either one of you can answer, both of you. I'm just curious to say, did you study like what motivated these people to start in the fan fiction, or they were all happened like to you, Cecilia, just by accident? Something happened, you know. I'm really curious to say, how many people, youth, have had a chance to be exposed to other learning opportunities, of course, including and besides, you know, fan fiction?
Well, what's interesting is that just if you look at just this one fan fiction site alone, which isn't even the fastest growing one, it has 8 million members. And 1.5 million of these members actually are authors of stories. And when we interviewed some of these people, they would say things like, well, I fell in love with a TV show or a movie or Harry Potter. And once the books were over, I didn't want them to end. So I started looking for more stories about Harry Potter, and I found fan fiction. And they usually start by reading, you know, legitimate peripheral participation, and then they move on into writing it themselves. And Katie, maybe you have a different viewpoint.
Well, I think really the key here, where it starts, is with a love of the topic. You know, you love something so much, Harry Potter, you fall in love with the world, and you don't want it to end. And sometimes, actually quite often, you may not see yourself in that world, or some storylines that you would like to see. And then fan fiction is an opportunity for you to write that yourself and storylines into the world, which is very empowering. So you've got a deep interest and passion, you've got this empowerment, and then really importantly, in online communities, you have a vast network of people who share that passion, and you can tap into that and not just get reinforcement, but get real support, and you have a real live audience for what you're producing. Sort of all the ingredients that we know are key to learning are happening in these online fan fiction communities. And as you mentioned, Young, it's not just fan fiction, it's many different online spaces, but they all, I think, have this common core of passion, interest-driven learning, and a community that holds it together.
So the passion is a big player in here. Chris, did you want to ask something?
Well, I want to make a couple observations that come out of why I've been fascinated by fan fiction. One observation is that many teachers, not all teachers, but many teachers, would say of some of their students, this student just doesn't like to read, or this student just doesn't like to write. But what really is the case is this student doesn't like to read what you're giving them, which often is awful. I mean, I went through my children having to read these politically correct things. It's a miracle that they graduated wanting to read anything ever again. And similarly with writing, they don't want to write what you're telling them to write. So the essence of all education is you start with what people care about, and then you help them to broaden what they care about. And that's one of the things I really like about fan fiction. But the other misconception is, and this is why Yang, I think, is interested and is asking some of his questions, that students can't learn anything they're not taught. Actually, there's things that students can learn only if they're not taught them. Collaboration, leadership, creativity. These are things that you learn when you're given the opportunity, but you can't learn if you're taught them. And so I think studies of all student, all things that students are the primary producers of, to broaden it as you did, Yang, are really interesting because they tell us what they care about, but they also tell us how they're doing things that are not possible in school.
Well, Chris, thank you. One point I've been trying to make, I'm trying to write a book now, just called Learners Without Borders. It's really trying to write to say, okay, you do not need a set of, today at least, highly qualified teachers for every group of students to make learning happen. And learning does take place in other places, and there is teaching going on. So Katie and Cecilia, tell us something about the mentoring, the teaching that's happening in this place. How does it happen?
Cecilia, do you want to start that one off?
All right. So yeah, so this phenomenon that Katie and I found that was going on in these fan fiction communities, we called distributed mentoring. And it's distributed because there are many, first of all, it's made possible by the affordances of online publics, where there are many people on there who can provide mentoring. And it's not traditional mentoring where it's one-on-one. Rather, it could be many-to-one or one-to-many or many-to-many. And our book goes into more detail about the many attributes of distributed mentoring. But one of the things that makes us so excited about it is that, yeah, you don't have one teacher or one, a master and an apprentice. A 13-year-old who maybe isn't that good at grammar, but knows a lot about Harry Potter, for example, can mentor, maybe an 18-year-old who is very good at grammar, but isn't as familiar with Harry Potter. And so that way the 13-year-old gets to feel validated, as well as having the experience of teaching and experiencing things like the tutor effect, where she reinforces her own learning. And so it's great for identity development, for self-actualization, as well as for, she receives learning on grammar from someone she sees as a peer. And she's doing something that she loves. And so she has all this positive affect and engagement and wants to learn a lot about what's going on. And so her grammar learning takes place in this very positive environment that makes her happy. And so she's more receptive and engaged about learning rules, which might seem boring in school. So that's just one example of the sort of thing distributed mentoring can provide. And I'll turn it over to Katie for some more examples.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the key things that we found is that, you know, we were very influenced by Jim G's work. He's well-known in the learning sciences, especially around his writing around affinity spaces. Because as Cecilia was saying, really what we're talking about in fan fiction communities is each individual person can be a mentor and a mentee at any given moment. So you can kind of go in and out of being an expert and a novice, and that can be very empowering and very generative. So that's really important for distributed mentoring. And then all of the affordances, as Cecilia said, of network technologies are also key. So it's no accident that this is happening online and bringing together people from many different countries who can really connect to each other across time and space, because what's happening is each person is providing some small piece of feedback to a writer. And those small pieces, they can come through many different channels. They can come through public channels, through reader reviews. They can come through private channels such as a private message, but all together in the aggregate, they start to form a picture of where the writer should take their work next. And so the concept of distributed mentoring is also influenced by the scholar Edwin Hutchins and his theory of distributed cognition, where you have many different people who each person knows a little bit and very key information, and together they can really do some really cool things. And so that's what's going on with distributed mentoring. And it's very, very different from what you typically get in the classroom, where you typically have a teacher giving one-on-one expert mentoring to a novice student. And there's really just that one-way transmission from one person. And, you know, it's not particularly motivating, especially if the topic isn't inherently interesting to the learner. And also when the learner is, student writes something and shares with their teacher, it's just their teacher who sees it, instead of potentially thousands of people online who share your exact interest. So when we think about distributed mentoring, I think the online piece is really key. The affinity space piece is really key. I also think that acts of creation, the fact that people are coming together, not just to share a love of something, but to share a love of creating something. And so this is why when we think of where else might distributed mentoring come up, I would say any place online where you have lots of people forming around a shared love, but they're also focused on creation. I think that is also really important.
Well, what you both said, I noticed is significant is this naturally, organically evolving with a massive base of users. And I'll return to that after Kurt. Kurt, do you have a question?
Sure. And first of all, before I ask and talk about things, Cecilia, where in Indiana were you from?
I'm from West Lafayette.
Aha.
Yes.
Okay. I once spoke in West Lafayette and I got a lot of tomatoes thrown at me because I wasn't speaking about math and science. I was trying to speak about computers and writing and stuff. And they're all engineering and computer science people up there. That was my first experience. When I came back, though, I had a better experience. I've been back many times. I think I spoke in a gymnasium in a high school there in West Lafayette.
Oh, really? That was probably the high school I went to. I remember those gymnasiums where I would get, where my classmates would beat me up.
It was tough for some people who are interested in literature to go to schools in Lafayette. Let's just say I've heard some parents that had kids to other schools, but I mean,
right. I should let you say your question, but I will say it was tough for me to grow up there. And
this is an interactive forum. No, it's but every time I do go back, everyone's handing me their newest computer program they're working on, all this cool stuff they're doing at Purdue. So Purdue's is a wonderful place. I will say
they're doing great stuff, and I have
amazing.
Many friends there. Yeah.
So just to give you a background a little bit, I was at Wisconsin where I was in the cognitive psych kind of area in ed psych studying computers and writing as thinking. And so I was studying essay and summary writing and developed a keystroke mapping program for my dissertation and a computer prompting program for critical and creative thinking with WordPerfect back in the day. And then when
I used that.
back in the day. And when 1990 hit, I was at West Virginia University. I did a national study of collaborative technologies.
Oh, really?
And for a couple of years, because experiment the Knowledge Builder tool, kind of like Scott Millian Bereiter's work and the Knowledge Forum or Cecil. And when I got to Indiana, we tested all that. So in the 90s, I was studying asynchronous from very low level things to what I call cooperative hypermedia. And then in the 2000s, I started studying synchronous in one study with Punya, in fact. And it led to work in Wikibooks and studying Wikibooks in that 2007, 2008, 2009, maybe before that a little bit. There was problems in Wikibooks. There wasn't the passion. Well, there was some passion of one single member, but they didn't get many people on board to do the Wikibook with them. So incomplete texts, there was frustration. There was a timing issue of doing the work. There were people deleting things, people adding things to people's books that they didn't want in them. It was really hard to organize and to get support and help when you're doing a Wikibook. And I did a couple within class projects with them. And first time it didn't work because they didn't scaffold it well. And later we got, internationalizing it. We had people in Beijing and Malaysia, in Taiwan, and in the US, various places. But when you're studying this, are you seeing any sense of frustration or issues of people around the world in different time zones, how they deal with some of those issues, expectations? My question is, what are the support structures? And are they doing these books by themselves and getting a mentor to help them structure it a little bit? Or are they getting help from people all around the world to draft and redraft? I mean, can you describe some of that and how it maybe has evolved or in somewhat?
So yeah, so kind of all of those things. That's a great question. So one of the things we found is that young people love the asynchronous nature of fanfiction.net and online communities in general, because they love that they can produce something creative. So if it's a fan fiction author, they can write a chapter, go to bed, and then they'll wake up in the morning and they'll have, a dozen reviews by people saying, oh, I loved your chapter. And then they'll ask specific questions and that'll inspire them to keep going. And I know, so I did an earlier study on Scratch, which is a system from MIT to help kids learn how to program.
Right.
And it was the same thing. I studied a group of children who were collaborating online. The youngest one was 7 years old, and they would create a little video game, and then they would go to sleep. And then people on the other side of the world, like from Russia or England, who are also in this group, would edit the game and improve it and then post it. And so in the morning, there was a new version of the game and they could continue working on it. And they found that actually better than synchronous work in some ways. So that's just one angle there. I'm sure Katie has several others that she'd like to say.
Well, I think one thing that you touched on, Kurt, that I think is really important is how the user interface is designed to support this type of community. And so we focused our work on two particular platforms, although when we started this work, we did a 9-month ethnography of 3 different fandoms, and it involved us going into many different spaces and different communities online that related to those fandoms. They were Harry Potter, Doctor Who, and My Little Pony, which is funny because Cecilia, my son, has discovered My Little Pony. So I know it so much better than I did when we were actually studying in a whole different way. Yeah, my favorite is definitely Pinkie Pie right now.
Okay.
I think one of our students, that was her favorite as well, Sarah.
Yeah.
But
right.
But our primary platform that we focused on was fanfiction.net, which I believe is still the largest fan fiction repository, but is probably going to be eclipsed at some point by Archive of Our Own.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, the user interface for that platform is very simple, but I think it kind of meets some key needs. So everyone has their own profile, so they can establish their own strong identity and signal what they love, and they can have all of their writing right there that you can see, and no one else can really touch that. So with you're talking about someone writing over someone else, which can be extremely frustrating, that really can't happen on this site. You've got a great system of leaving reviews underneath a particular story or a chapter of a fan fiction book. And the author can then respond. And so you can have this, you know, this persistent record of all the feedback that you're getting on a chapter or a full story of yours, and you can keep going back to that. And I think that, and writers really use that, and they really look and read all of their reviews. And then you have an ability to communicate with people one-on-one on the site. And then of course you can always, as you meet people, you can communicate with them. You take it off of fanfiction.net. So I think it's a simple user interface, but it's something I think you actually will find in other online spaces as well. When we were writing the book, we thought, well, where else might you find this sort of simple profile with posting what you've done and getting responses? And there are a lot of online platforms that have that basic structure. One example is the knitting site Ravelry. There are other, of course, fan focused sites like DeviantArt, which is not fan fiction, but it's fan art. It's sort of set up in that way. But I think one of the key things, well, two key things, it's really that individual profile, which signals your passion, combined with the ability to easily connect with other people and have that sense of community.
Yeah, it's important to have feedback on there. In the 90s, Chris Neuwirth at Carnegie Mellon built Prep Editor. And in Prep Editor, you had the paper and you had on the side, each column, people's comments would appear. So your paper gets squished and you'd have all these comments shooting off on the side of it. And I think that got commercialized at one point. Do people develop these tools, or they just contribute and say, hey, it's available? Or, I mean, does someone get credit for building these things?
Are you talking about fan fiction or about collaborative online tools?
Well, the tool that they're putting all this work in. Oh, they're all separate? They're all separate tools?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that, so fanfiction.net, which was kind of the first fan fiction site that we studied, is not created by the authors themselves. It's just an interface when people post content. However, Archive of Our Own is very interesting because it developed as a response to this idea that somebody else, mostly a non-fan fiction writer, could be creating and possibly profiting off creative content. And so Archive of Our Own is a really fascinating community because it's all fan fiction authors, mostly women, and they taught themselves how to code, and they built a site that incorporates all the aspects that fan fiction authors want to see. And as a matter of fact, it's now the fastest growing fan fiction site in the world. And that's where a lot of the older people go to. We studied fanfiction.net because it's where younger people tend to go first. It's, the 85% are between 13 and 20 years of age, and the median age is 15 and a half on fanfiction.net.
So I'm sorry, Chris, let me just throw something for us to think about. Not necessarily to answer yet, just to think about building a community like this. It's massive. Okay, so it's self-evolving. It happens. I'm sure many of them died, very soon. So something happened over there. So just think about, which I will ask you later on to talk a little bit about how do we expand this to formalized schools. In many schools right now, I think one thing schools do encourage is Minecraft. And beyond that, I don't see, I'm scratched, to a certain degree sometimes. So I want to ask you later on, after Chris talking to you, is to say, how do we learn and take the top things you find, the basic rules, principles that apply to these communities into other contexts? Chris, go ahead.
Well, I'll actually say something that was related to what you just said, Yang. So,
okay, go ahead.
So as background, one of the themes that's been persistent in Silver Lining for Learning that all of us who co-founded this believe in is that when you're put into this forced situation of remote learning, the worst thing you can do is try to make the home into a classroom and to enforce the classroom curriculum and the classroom assessments. And there's a lot of writing about why that's a terrible idea that doesn't seem to discourage people from doing it anyway. And in writing some blog posts, I looked at what really good teachers are doing, creative teachers who are bottom up, inventing ways to help students in this situation. And one of the themes that came out was teachers were asking students to write about how the pandemic was affecting their community. And they were getting these wonderful, very heartfelt writings from students that then could become the basis for actually leading into not all of the curriculum. I don't think it has anything to do with quadratic equations, but certainly large parts of the curriculum, particularly in the social sciences and the liberal arts, that really are important and that a good teacher can take students to. So I'm imagining, but I'd love to get your answer to this, that real life, what's happening in students' real life shapes what they write about in fan fiction. And certainly students in this age range have lived through school shootings, they've lived through the murder of people of color, they've lived through the pandemic. Do you see a ripple effect into fan fiction? And do you think that is unhealthy or healthy? I guess I would put it.
I would say, so at the time when we were doing this research and reading the stories, this was 2013, 2014, when we were doing a deep dive. And I would say probably, there's a long history of this, but a lot of the themes that we were finding were absolutely, in a general sense, the authors are writing themselves and their lived experiences into the worlds that they love already, but that they may not see themselves in. And what comes through very strongly when we were doing this work is in particular in the area of gender. And this very much reflects Cecilia's personal experience. And so if you are a girl, a woman, and most of the protagonists in the world that you love are men, or the people who get to do the cool stuff in the world are the men, you can just rewrite them and make them women. And then also with respect to sexual identity and gender identity, you have a lot of play around those things and a lot of exploration around sexuality in fan fiction. And there's a long history of that, and that I think comes out really strongly. Cecilia, did you want to say anything more about those types of themes?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with everything you said, Katie, and this is a great question, Chris. Another issue that we've seen that's especially relevant, I think, now with the visibility of systemic racism coming to the fore in the United States, is a lot of people of color were writing stories to give themselves a voice and to create characters that looked like themselves and that address some of the questions that they saw. They tend to be smaller in number, but it still is a vital outlet for, say, right? Somebody from a marginalized race, growing up in a community where maybe she doesn't see a lot of people who look like her. Maybe, I mean, I'll give my example maybe because it's something I'm familiar with, but all my teachers were white when I was growing up. And I still remember that I got accused of plagiarizing because I had a large vocabulary, and they said, well, you know, Hispanics don't have large vocabularies because they can't speak English. And so therefore I must not have come up with those words on my own. And we still see that today, certainly. And, you know, and there's more complex issues around race that I think we as a culture in the United States have not really dealt with. And fan fiction offers a safe space for people to explore many of these interesting questions. You know, for example, my second grade teacher told me to mark black on a census form, you know, which is kind of hard to believe, you know, but I said, I don't think I'm black. And she said, well, you sure as heck aren't white.
You know, Cecilia and Katie, you touched on the issue. Actually, we were going to ask you about race in this one. I'm going to move away from our even original question just to dive deeper into this. And your research, right, so far is only on English, right? Have you studied other languages?
Well, for fan fiction, we've only focused on English. And that's primarily because the students we've been working with, that's the language that they all know. I have studied Spanish and French because I speak both of those languages, but those are in other online communities. So we can't really speak about it in terms of fan fiction, but I will say there are over 70 different languages on fanfiction.net. English is far and away the largest. From a percentage point, I think it's like 83%. I may be wrong on that, but they're definitely, because there's so much, there are 60 billion words of English fan fiction on this one site, and there are, you know, at least 1 billion words of French and Spanish, and so there are very large communities in these other languages, and it's a very rich community for people to study this. As a matter of fact, Rebecca Black, who at the University of San Diego has done some really excellent work studying English language learners on fan fiction sites, where a lot of people were teaching themselves English, right, through this kind of distributed mentoring. She didn't use that. She was talking before we did, but they were writing and getting help from native English speakers and you know, having this type of mentoring, and it was very powerful and very positive for them. You know, whereas in other communities, you know, I know that when my parents showed up at my school and spoke with thick accents, my classmates made fun of them and of me just for their accents.
You know, that's I remember 1993, I was at the University of Illinois. This is Kurt, by the way, how I met you. You were already at Indiana running your the conference on collaborative writing. I started a website, you know, at that time, everything just got started. I was a graduate student there, and a website to have students, non-native speakers of English who are learning English to contribute writing to a website I was building. I was there only for a couple of years. We just ran this couple of years. It was kind of fun. It could have become a fan fiction club. That was, but I stopped it. So that's, but the racial issue. I'm just curious to see the reason I ask about language. You know, like I'm Chinese. You know, I came to this country in the 1990s. You know, in China, and other places, I'm sure there are similar sites that's happening. And so, you know, when you're talking about your experience, it hides the race issue. Are there any racial contentions on these sites? Which thing I will actually ask you to branch out into some of the negative consequences, cyberbullying, people are talking about, you know, all those kind of bad things that could happen, you know.
Right. Okay, so I'm happy to talk about the negative part, because of course that's something Katie and I wondered about, because there's so much what's called flaming, personal attacks online. And if you go to any news site and look at the anonymous comments, you'll see people really being nasty. And so we expected we would find this in fan fiction as well, because there are some people who, well, let's be straightforward, these are young people learning to write, and some of their stories are not that skillful. And yet we were really surprised to find that out of all these, 177 million reviews, a very small number were flame reviews, less than 1%. And what we also found that was interesting is when there was a very negative review, and I don't mean critical, I mean a personal attack or hate speech. Immediately what would happen is a lot more other people would jump on and would write reviews saying, don't listen to this hateful person, they're wrong, your story is great. And so it was kind of self-correcting in that way, that instead of being amplified, instead of hate speech being amplified, like I think it sometimes gets on Facebook and some other social media where it's all about, driving attention to it. In this case, the community, because it's focused and they don't care how many people look at the reviews, right? So what's happening is this community is sort of self-correcting, and people who love that character or who love that story will jump in to protect the author, because they understand they might feel alone. And so that author will feel welcomed and like it's a positive community, and the flamer will be discouraged and will go away. That's at least what we saw happen over and over again.
Great, thanks, Katie. You want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we are very mindful. There's a whole, phenomenon called toxic fandom, and there's a lot of negativity online that is specifically associated with fandom, and particularly, there's lots of examples where the harassment is targeted at people of color. With Star Wars, for example, there was a whole experience for the Kelly Marie Tran, who portrayed the first female main character of color in 2018, and she was subject to really horrible online harassment from Star Wars fanboys. So this is definitely out there. But in our pocket of fan fiction, this is what we saw, is what Cecilia mentioned. And I think, as Cecilia said, it's really because people are very passionate, and they are there to advance the work that they care about. And I think one thing that happens in these communities is the more that people come back, and although they're anonymous, they're really more pseudonymous. So they are identifying with whatever handle they have, and they feel a sense of responsibility. They often will start as novice writers, and as they continue writing and getting feedback, they start to give feedback to others, and they know what a feeling of vulnerability it is to put yourself out there. And so this is why, as Cecilia said, I think you see the more established writers often come to the defense of newer writers, because there's this deep sense of empathy and a feeling of responsibility for this community. This is not by any means what it's like in all pockets of fandom online, but in the pocket that we studied, we found that, and it was very heartening. And I think particularly since we hear so much about online hate speech and cyberbullying and things like that, it is possible to avoid that under the right circumstances.
So I guess, go ahead, Chris.
There's just one more theme I want to make sure that we get to before we run out of time, because we could talk about any of these things for really a long time. And that's the theme of transfer. So Sherry Turkle, as you know, has written a lot about when you develop a second self, that's the online self in a game or some other community, or or life on the screen, where life on the screen becomes more meaningful to you than real life, because your real life is dreadful. I mean, it's an understandable thing. How you get what you gain in the online world, in the fandom community, to empower you in real life and to bring you back into real life. And I'm curious as to whether you see kind of a path that different people take, where some people retreat into fandom, but other people take what they've learned in fandom and bring it back into the real world. I'm very interested in what you would respond to that.
So yeah, I have a response unless you want to go, Katie.
You go and then I'll add, because I
right.
definitely think that's an important question.
Yeah, that's a very important question. Thanks for asking it, Chris. Yeah, so this is something, you know, the idea of, oh, this is just escapism, you're running away from your, you know, the real life, right? And so I would like to give as an example, one of our students who worked with us at the University of Washington. She was an undergraduate, and we do quote from her pretty extensively in the book, because when she was in middle school, she said she was a queer, autistic middle schooler who had no idea that she was either of those things. And she didn't know how to fit in her real life community. And she didn't know how to interact socially with people. And so she started up in fan fiction communities, first as a reader, and then eventually as a writer and producing creative content. And what she found is that that was the scaffolding that enabled her to learn social contact. And she says now she has no separation between her fandom life and her real world life. She's a leader. You know, she leads panels. She has a large group of friends and followers. And to me, you know, when I met her as a junior and then a senior, I said, wow, she's a very confident and articulate young woman. And I would not have known that she had these types of issues when she was younger. So and she says she's not alone. You know, she says there are many people in her community that have also done that too. And I feel like I'm saying a lot of my personal life, and I'm sorry. I hope that's okay. But I feel that when I went from being a child who is not very welcomed in middle school, when I emerged as I got older into a community that was welcoming of me for who I was, I found I was able to speak. I had selective mutism as a child. I had a lot of trouble talking to anybody. And yet that feeling of welcome is amazingly powerful. A feeling of, here are people who are kind of like me in some way, and they want to hear what I have to say, instead of every time I open my mouth being called a racial epithet. There's a huge difference in what it can do for a young person. And I have to say this, the welcoming community, for me, it was in college when I went to Caltech, and also when I became a pilot. I actually wrote a memoir about how I overcame fear and learned to fly, but that's another question. But the point is that a welcoming community of fan fiction writers can enable people to write. We've seen this happen. We've seen people become professional authors, in large part due to the tremendous amounts of support that they receive in this site. And so I feel that there is at least a clear path going from this community to the greater world.
Katie?
Yeah, I would just add that I think in both Cecilia's case and Ruby's case, you know, they initially found that their voice, and they were able to find a space where they were building these skills. But then they also found an opportunity to connect that into other aspects of their lives. And making that connection, I don't think is a given. And I think that, you know, we can't just assume that all youth who are in these communities are going to be able to know how to connect it to their other aspects of their lives. and they may need some support. And I think for me, one of my areas of study is identity. And when I first came to this topic, there was a lot of excitement and celebration about, oh, you can be all these different people. But I believe then, and I still believe it's important to have some sort of coherence among these many different people that you can be. And we don't walk around, I think, feeling like 10 or 20 different people inherently. There's some sort of coherence there, ideally. And I think if we can find ways to take what's happening in these communities and help young people find those connections. Some of them, they find them themselves. They come, like Cecilia, they find an offline community that is welcoming, and it's a perfect testing ground to bring everything they've learned. But we can't just take that for granted.
This is, time goes by so fast. I still have, I got to get you to answer this question. Chris knows very well, and Kurt, and a lot of people knows this very well. There are a lot of great things happening outside education. Gaming is wonderful. Kids love to do gaming. Okay, kids love to do this. As soon as you bring them into school, then school kills all of them. Basically, they just become so boring. What happens here? So what I'm really, where our audience, a lot of them are educators. I think hopefully some people from outside. I'm really curious to learn from the two of you. Each of you can maybe speak 1.5 minutes to just to say, okay, what do you think we can do to take this kind of ideas, put into the educational context, and what can we learn from this? I'm just anything.
Well, we do end the book musing about this, and the title of this section is called The Third Rail, because this is such a tricky topic of how do you bring this interest-driven, passion-fueled informal learning into a formal, can those things even go together? And I feel like perhaps the motivation for starting this Silver Lining for Learning chats is because if we're going to do it, perhaps now is the time when things are just being exploded right now. And so I'm right now conducting a study tracking teens in Seattle and Germany about how they're coping during the pandemic. And one thing that a lot of them are saying is that they love, there's a lot of things that are not going particularly well with their online learning, but they love that they can go at their own pace. And they also love that they have more time just not commuting and not doing all these class time to just do their own thing and follow their interests. And so I guess I am sort of optimistic that perhaps we can find a way, if we can just blow things up a little bit and scramble up what we're doing, and then find a way to bring this interest-centered learning into the classroom.
Thanks, Katie.
Cecilia, I'll give you the last word.
I mean, that was so wonderful. I don't want to add to that because I totally agree with everything you said. And I think that's a wonderful note to end it on.
I think the flexibility, control, time, path, you should write this up. send us what when you're done, send us the list of what you've come up with that works.
Well, thank you, by the way, Katie. I know it's already midnight already in Germany, and thanks, Cecilia. So this has really helped me a lot, and I hope helped our audience. It is really important for us to think outside the school system. A lot of times when we talk about education reform, we're really confined by how schools have been doing. And when we come to schools, we think about the curriculum, we think about the teacher, we think about the assessment, we think about the grades. Well, that's how we think about it. Then whatever we do, we judge about our responsibilities as adults. But I think what you've studied, what you brought to us are a naturally evolved, kind of organizing organic communities of learning. That's natural. And of course, with the understanding that what you've studied are successful communities that have succeeded. I'm sure there are many more that have not succeeded, but that's part of life. right? In many ways. And we have so many schools that should have been closed, but they're still open, so that's the challenge. So what I'm hoping all of us today have heard something that's really amazing. That's amazing. I hope, you'll be bringing us more research on other learning communities like this, and you guys have been wonderful. Now I'm going to give this to Chris, who will announce our next episode. Chris, please.
Yeah, so I'm excited about a week from today, which will center on South Korea and on Singapore. I put a post on this on the SLL website. Nina Lim is a former student at Harvard. She works with Paul Kim at Stanford. She teaches first grade in California, but she teaches it from South Korea. So she's doing remote learning with first graders across the Pacific Ocean, which is itself an interesting story. Chi-Kit Louis is a senior learning scientist and policy person in in Singapore. And he has studied a lot of what's happening in terms of home learning in Singapore, as opposed to putting the classroom into the home. And I think that's fascinating. He also thinks a lot about scale, which I think about. And these are two countries that have very top-down educational systems. So looking at how bottom-up creativity can happen and can make a difference is fascinating. So I hope you'll join us a week from today to interact with Nina and Chi-Kit.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much.